I think as a kid, everyone wants to think that they are smart. But in reality, very few of us are truly gifted. And every time I wrestled with this, the fact that people are just better and quicker and smarter than me, those were the times where my imposter syndrome would set in the most. And it was always a crushing blow to my confidence, one that almost made me leave my software career pretty early on. And today I wanted to share my stories of imposter syndrome in software and my steps I took to overcome it. To understand my struggle with imposter syndrome, first, I need to explain the background behind my overconfidence in general. I was an average computer science student in college, maybe even below average. I graduated with a very weak resume in general, and it took me a long time before I could find my first software job. When I graduated, I felt like I deserved a job. I felt entitled to a job simply because I had gone through 4 years of school. But when the reality set in, I realized that no one was going to promise me or give me or grant me a job for free. I had to be good enough to earn it. And I was humbled during that first job search. I was shown exactly what a bottom tier candidate looks like. It was me. And after the whole experience, I was finally able to get my first job. And after I got it, I was willing to do anything, to put in all the hours and the work needed into this job in order to make sure I never fell into that situation ever again. But the thing is that people don't really change easily. Who you are, it doesn't change easily. I think we all have some sort of mold of who we are that was formed when we were kids. And without constant self-reflection, without constant deliberate improvement, we just slowly fall back into these molds. I came into this job as a sponge, humbled by the search and ready to put in the hours. 6 months into that job, an opportunity opened up for me to develop a web portal, which is something that I wanted to do ever since I was in college. I was given the design and a hard deadline of 2 weeks, and I was tasked with taking on the project essentially all on my own. And so with almost no experience in the field, I pounced on the opportunity to prove myself. And in the end, I produced a site that barely worked, was barely maintainable, but I still felt a sense of deep accomplishment. And the project was released and we started using my code. And after that, even though objectively it wasn't great work, I started to feel pretty good about myself. And I think then I started to develop a large amount of overconfidence in my skills. I started feeling again like I was entitled to things without truly having earned it in the first place. You might be asking what this has to do with imposter syndrome. This was a time in my career when I had the highest confidence in my software abilities. I think for any topic, the time when you have the most confidence is right when you've learned just a little tiny bit about it. Just the tip of the iceberg. And after you learn just a little bit more, that is when you realize just how truly lost you are. I was teetering right on the edge of this, and I was just massively overconfident in my abilities. When I finished that project, I suddenly feel like I had conquered web development. And because of that, I wanted more. I felt like I deserved more in my career. I felt like I was smart and I was some sort of incredible web developer. Online, I had always heard about people saying that your second software job is 1,000 times easier to get than your first software job. And that's exactly what I experienced. In about a month, I was able to get a new job at a new small startup with a new salary, new coworkers, and I was ready to prove myself. And while I thought I was ready, what was coming up was an experience that almost broke my career. The first day working at this new startup was my first true experience with imposter syndrome. Before that point, I had only developed web front ends, essentially using tutorials that I found on either YouTube or on Udemy. But on the first day of this job, I was tasked with following an extremely long onboarding process in order to get our web development local environment set up, which is pretty standard for most companies. And I was getting absolutely overwhelmed, just so stressed out. And this was the first time since I was looking for a job that I felt truly lost. And it was kind of like this every day at this new job for days, weeks, eventually about a month. I took time staying up late, trying to work late, trying to figure things out. And in my head, I started to get more and more anxiety from the impatience that I perceived from my coworkers and my manager. I felt like they were slowly getting more and more frustrated that I couldn't understand these concepts quickly enough. I couldn't do things quickly enough. I kept asking too many questions that were stupid. And I began to overthink even the smallest of non-verbal cues from them. Like every twitch, every sigh, every Slack message that I sent that I didn't get a response to quickly enough. And I started to become a nervous wreck. And that day-to-day anxiety made it difficult for me to focus on the progress that I was making. And all of this stress peaked about 1 month into the job when I was assigned a massive project that spanned all layers of front-end, back-end, and database design. And the whole time I was developing it, I was beyond stressed. And every time I would try to get more clarity in my project by asking my coworkers or my manager, they would say things to me that would just sound like gibberish, and I would come out each conversation even more confused than when I had went in. And so I still continued to press on, to just bang my head against the wall for this project. And meanwhile, I saw my coworkers around me finishing projects way faster than me, moving on to different assignments, releasing code to production. And 2 months later, here I was, still working on this one project. And at that time, at the end of the 2 months, I was told that whatever I had, it needed to go out. And it was probably the worst feature I've ever released into production up until that point in my life. Before I even released it, I knew it was going to be bad, but I didn't say anything. And in the first hour, I got some good feedback, and then all of the negative feedback started to arrive. Every 5 minutes, every couple of minutes, I would just see messages, DMs, streams into one of the Slack channel about things that didn't work properly. And my backlog started to pile up more and more and more. I don't think I've ever been as stressed at any point in my life as I was during that moment. And honestly, it was at this point, 1.5 years into my career, where I just realized, like, damn, being a software engineer, sometimes it can be really, really hard. And every day I thought what my life would be like if I quit software altogether. Every day I thought, what if I'm just not cut out for this? And that was true imposter syndrome. All this stress of me feeling like I was being outclassed by my coworkers, that I wasn't smart, that I couldn't get things done, and that I was slow at programming. This feeling lasted for months and months after that big project. And when it came time to take on a new project, I was so scarred by the release of that old one that I wanted to work to make sure my future projects were as good as they could possibly be. Essentially, I put pressure on myself. I would work later, I would work harder, I would work on weekends until I would get the job done. And all this stress and feelings of imposter syndrome started to cause me a lot of really strange mental health problems. I started to become really easily irritable, even though generally I think I'm a pretty calm person. I started to behave kind of erratically, like last minute canceling a Thanksgiving trip home to visit my parents because I was just so stressed out. And this feeling lasted like 8 months, where I just felt so dumb and so slow, and that I had to put in so much work into what I was doing. And then I remember I was sitting at the office on a Friday at like 9 p.m. or something, trying to push out a project that had a deadline of Wednesday or whatever. And I took a moment to think, like, what am I doing? Was I here because I was afraid of being fired? Was I here because I was afraid of disappointing someone? Was I here because I was afraid of feeling inadequate about my software skills? I couldn't really tell which one of these things were true. And that day I just left and I went to go clear my head. And I realized just how much personal pain I was causing myself, that I was creating in my own head. And it caused me to reflect about a few things. The first was that some people are just better software engineers, and that there's no point in really comparing my experience to that of my coworkers or really anyone else. For the past few months, I would watch my coworkers pick up new concepts very quickly, learn new technologies really quickly just by reading through documentation, just code 3 times as fast as me, and it made me feel completely left in the dust. And I took it as some personal failing that I couldn't code as quickly as they could or do things as quickly as they could. But I realized that this was the wrong way of thinking about this. I was causing myself a ton of stress by comparing myself to them all the time. Because they were able to get things done so much faster than me, I just assumed it was because I wasn't smart. I wasn't cut out for this, and that I would just never be able to do things like that. But the big portion that I was missing was that I hadn't put in the time and work into this field like they had. My coworkers, they had been in the industry longer, they had more experience, and the pure amount of hours they put into software engineering was just way more than me at the time. How could I compare myself to them without just causing myself undue stress? There's no shame in me learning slower and doing things slower, because in reality, all that really mattered was that I was a productive and contributing member to the team. And that was persistent in my learning. I was never the best at what I did, but I think I was persistent. The second thing I realized was that I was reading into my coworkers and my managers' nonverbal communication way too deeply. Sometimes I would be in conversations with people and my anxiety would just cause me to read into all these things that weren't there. I would stress out that I wasn't living up to their expectations, and I would just stress that I wasn't a good software engineer and I was holding the company down or something. And I realized that no one ever told me these things to my face. I told them to myself. And because I kept telling myself these things, I kept pushing myself harder and harder and eventually just running my mental health into the ground. The truth is that in any company worth its salt, you will be told when you're not performing well. The job of a manager is to tell you and to give you feedback when you can do things better. And creating scenarios in your own head is just causing you stress that doesn't exist and doesn't need to be there. My theory on this is that for me and a lot of other software engineers like me, we're all on the more introverted and introspective side. We think not only about what people are saying, but why people are saying it, which can sometimes help us to be more empathetic, but other times it can turn us into nervous wrecks that everyone is out to get us, when in reality, none of that is even true. And the third thing I realized was that I really needed to work to push back on deadlines. I was socially awkward and I didn't feel like I needed to improve my social skills because I just thought, well, I'm an engineer, I don't need that stuff. But there was one big problem here. Because I never properly learned how to communicate my thoughts or concerns or push back on deadlines, I would eat the stress of projects and deadlines on my own. When I was given unrealistic deadlines to meet, I would say yes. When I was given extra work added onto my project with the same deadline, I would say yes. When I was assigned a project with no real due date, just ASAP, I would say cool. And I would just work as hard as I could on it, as fast as I could. And all this stress could have been avoided if I had just stated my mind from the get-go. I am a people pleaser. And I think with people like me, our general sense is to say yes to everything. But in doing so, we take on all the stress quietly. And while taking on all that stress, all of that workload, those are the times in your career when you can fall down the rabbit hole of imposter syndrome most easily, because those are the times you feel the most inadequate in your career. And the last thing I realized was that at the end of the day, this was just a job. Either I'm doing well enough to not get fired, or I'm doing poorly enough to get fired. But causing myself so much stress and anxiety about it was just making me a nervous wreck. And if your imposter syndrome is causing you that many problems for your life, like it was for me, maybe it's time to take a step back and focus on a little bit of introspection and to find a balance between your work and your life. Once I reflected on all these things, my imposter syndrome at this company and in all my subsequent companies began to fade, and I was able to focus more on what I was doing over time. One thing that over time helped me conquer my imposter syndrome was continuously learning over time and being curious about different topics in tech in order to continue building confidence in my skills. If you're struggling with imposter syndrome and you need a way to learn quickly and easily, you might want to check out the sponsor of today's video, Brilliant. Brilliant is the best way to learn math, data science, and computer science interactively. Whatever your skill level, Brilliant customizes content to fit your needs and lets you solve at your own pace. So I remember back in college, I took a whole class about search engines and how they work. It was a really mind-boggling course about how sites like Google index through the entire web extremely quickly. But it's been a while since college. And recently, while looking through Brilliant, I found the course How Search Engines Work. And it just completely brought back all these concepts that I loved learning when I was taking this class back in college. And even more helpful than that, it helped me to review a lot of concepts about graphs and recursion that are directly applicable to my software engineering interview life and my software prep for interviews. And it really brought me back to this time in college when I was learning interactively with friends. It was a really fun, quick, and easy way of learning in bite-sized chunks. I might be less willing to sit through a longer class, but Brilliant is so good at breaking down these topics into such small, manageable chunks, complete with their own unique animations, that it's really hard not to love it. Join the millions of people already learning on Brilliant with a special offer just for listeners. Head to the link brilliant.org/KC to get started with Brilliant's interactive lessons. There is a 30-day free trial included with the link. The first 200 listeners will also get 20% off an annual membership. And as always, thanks for watching.